Welcome, everyone, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where we are going to continue our exploration into the topic of science unshackled. We've had a lot of very interesting leaps into this realm over the course of the last several weeks, with Michael Claridge going through Function in the Cosmos, an incredible presentation by Dr. Denis Rancourt last week, and before that we had something by John Place on the issue of Paolo Sarpi and what the hell happened to Western science, such that the explosive developments in not only science and astronomy and medicine, in architecture, but also the arts and statecraft, how was that derailed in the form of the Enlightenment? What happened? So, John, for those who haven't seen, give a good introduction to Paolo Sarpi and the Venetian role in taking over the narrative of what science is and how is it done. Today, Cynthia and I, we just came back. I mean, it's been a couple of weeks now. We came back from our international speaking tour, where we got to meet a lot of very interesting people. And this presentation, which we're about to hear today, was sort of crafted in the course of a lot of these discussions that we've had in Europe, around something which is very present on many people's minds, which is the question of, is technology really the cause of our problems? Will AI, will all of these things replace humanity, as we're often told, both in the mainstream Davos clique, but also in alternative media, opinionators who are all of different opinions, but revolving around the exact same assumption, which is ultimately, yes, technology has destroyed nature. It's potentially going to enslave us, and really, there's a lot of things to be worried about and concerned about. And as Cynthia is going to expound today, this is not one of those issues. And in fact, the origins of a lot of the thoughts that are misshaping our future and have misshaped so much of the 20th century can be found in the bowels of the city of London and some very nasty imperialists, even as early as the late 18th century. So without saying anything else that might spoil some surprises, Cynthia, I will leave it to you.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. The title of this presentation, as Matt said, this was originally delivered at the conference that we were kindly invited to speak at in Basel, Switzerland, by the Kunpunkt. It's on the topic of H.G. Wells's World Brain and Yuval Harari's Hackable Human, and how such endeavors will not succeed. Here, let me just, there we go. So in 2018, Yuval Harari delivered a presentation to the World Economic Forum titled, "Will the Future Be Human?" In his presentation, Harari seemed to be confirming our very worst fears of a dystopic future right out of a sci-fi movie, that we risked annihilating ourselves if we continued down the path we were already on as we progressed into an age of advanced technology. Right, I'm gonna keep that, sorry. These stark predictions by Harari were received almost as if he were a prophet. His visions of the future he was certain would come about, but he was unclear as to any detail concerning such a future, when it would come about, how it would come about, and most importantly, exactly how do we avoid such a fate. When Harari was questioned after his presentation and in another Q&A session at the same World Economic Forum meeting, all Harari could repeat was his own algorithm for a very general doomsday prophecy. To all other questions that pertained to specifics or mechanics of how such a dystopic future would play out, he would answer that he did not know. This should strike any thinker as problematic. That is, are we supposed to listen to Harari as if he were a scholar or a prophet? If we are to take Harari as a scholar that has developed insight into the subjects he discusses from the studies he has made, then it is a problem that he cannot discuss such specifics, but rather entirely avoids them. In fact, as we break down Harari's own algorithms that he uses to form his vision for a dystopic future, we see them riddled with personal assumptions, judgments, and conclusions masked as objective algorithms. Note for people who are not maybe aware, an algorithm is a process or set of rules to be calculated or used in problem-solving operations, especially by a computer. Before we look at some of these biological algorithms of Harari, which have purported his theory that humans are hackable, we should quickly review how such a mathematical and evolutionary viewpoint came to be accepted in the first place within academia in defining human nature and the universe we live in. Harari has heavily drawn from the works of Darwin, Bertrand Russell, and H.G. Wells in his work, and thus it is useful for us to review how their works influenced our understanding of human nature and the universe. That is, how a modern science was created to in turn create a modern religion, which in turn would promise us a modern utopia. If this sounds outlandish to you, may I remind you that H.G. Wells, as well as Russell, Aldous Huxley, and Harari himself have written and discussed about the need to bring such a thing about. In Harari's presentation to the World Economic Forum in 2020, the moderator brought up the parallels of George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World in relation to Harari's predictions of the future. This is most certainly relevant, but not in the way you may be thinking. This excerpt from Huxley's Brave New World gets at the very core justification for why a scientific dictatorship is needed and how it is perpetuated, namely by denying purpose and by denying intention. This does not just pertain to us discussing evolution in human nature, but even to how the universe itself functions. If someone wants to read that quote.
My internet is really choppy, so I'd ask anybody else to volunteer.
I'll read it for you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Quote, A New Theory of Biology, unquote, was the title of the paper which Mustafa Mohn had just finished reading. He sat for some time, meditatively frowning, then picked up his pen and wrote across the title page. The author's mathematical treatment of the conception of purpose is novel and highly ingenious, but heretical and, so far as the present social order is concerned, dangerous and potentially subversive, not to be published. A pity, he thought, as he signed his name. It was a masterly piece of work, but once you begin admitting explanations in terms of purpose, well, you didn't know what the result might be. It was the sort of idea that might easily decondition the more unsettled minds among the higher castes, make them lose their faith and happiness as the sovereign good, and take to believing, instead, that the goal was somewhere beyond, somewhere outside the present human sphere, that the purpose of life was not the maintenance of well-being, as the lower forms of happiness and comfort, but some intensification and refining of consciousness, some enlargement of knowledge, which was, the controller reflected, quite possibly true, but not, in the present circumstance, admissible.
Right, so that was an excerpt from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and I think it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk about some elements of this with Aldous's implications to this, but for people who want more information, I did write a series specifically focusing on Aldous that people can find on my Substack, Who Will Be Brave in Huxley's New World. So in fact, Aldous is the continuation of that legacy to deny purpose in the sciences. It was his grandfather, T.H. Huxley, who self-professed himself as Darwin's bulldog, who propelled Darwin's theory of evolution to such heights that the entire field of the sciences were never to be the same again. They were to become the modern sciences. What this meant was that centuries upon centuries of scientists from all around the world, from diverse cultures who had largely viewed the universe as having intention and purpose with a creator, were now to be relegated to the dustbins of irrelevance. Darwin had apparently proved that the universe was without purpose and that there was no creator with no intelligent design. However, this is not true. Darwin never proved such a thing. Darwin's theory of evolution came about after reading Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, what would in turn coin the term Malthusianism or Malthusian in referring to population control policies. This point of catastrophe, as shown in the graph, is calculated as the point when the human population will exceed its carrying capacity. However, what determines the carrying capacity? Just to let people know who might not be aware, carrying capacity is the calculated number of organisms that an ecosystem can sustainably support. Thomas Malthus, who created the Malthusian growth model, never actually specified an exact number for when the human population would hit its carrying capacity. This was because it was understood that the carrying capacity is not something fixed, but could be increased or decreased depending on human-made innovations such as agriculture. Thomas Malthus did, however, make the prophecy that we would hit our carrying capacity by 1890, about 100 years from the time he made his prediction, which, needless to say, was very much off the mark. It should be noted that Malthus was fully convinced that his prophecy was accurate and that the only way to avoid such a catastrophe was to severely curb the growth of the human population immediately. This included the denial of medical care and food to the needy, since it was thought by the followers of Malthus that the postponement of their death would only use up further resources without any contribution to society. The reason why Malthus was so far off the mark was because such a point in the future concerning the human carrying capacity cannot be determined by a linear extrapolation, as Malthus attempts in this graph. This is because human innovations change our relationship to the resources we use in a qualitative manner and not just a quantitative manner. Qualitative change has always been the mathematician's nightmare in producing models that will supposedly predict trends in the future. How can a mathematical model predict all qualitative change that will happen in the future, which would mean a prediction of all future forms of innovation, invention, and discovery? Is it even possible? Thus far, the answer is no. As we will see, this is a common theme when analyzing mathematical models that attempt to predict the distant future. If someone, yes, if someone can read this, sorry.
I'll go again, Cynthia.
Okay, thank you.
In Thomas Malthus' Essay on the Principle of Population, 1799, he wrote, quote, "We should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague." Bold-faced emphasis added.
In 1838, upon reading Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, Darwin formulated his theory for evolution based on natural selection of the fittest. He coined the term as an analogy of what he termed the artificial selection of selective breeding, with reference in particular to the practice of horse breeding. Darwin saw a similarity between farmers picking the best stock in selective breeding and a Malthusian nature selecting from chance variance. That is, Darwin's idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest implied no directionality to evolution, but rather was based upon nature's selection of random variance. But how does one part of an organism evolve without affecting the other parts of said organism? Contrary to how we are made to think of the discussion of evolution today, by the first part of the 1800s, the scientific community was primarily in agreement that living processes and their environments did indeed evolve. That is, Charles Darwin was among many scientists at the time who were proponents of evolution. It was not a one-man show. The debate was thus not if evolution was indeed occurring, but rather how evolution was occurring. Again, contrary to how we are encouraged to think of this discussion today, there are many prominent and well-respected scientists in this field who did not think that the process of evolution contradicted the existence of a creator with an intelligent design. Georges Cuvier lived from 1769 to 1832, and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire are two prominent examples of this. Their pioneering work in evolution is respected to this day, which opened up questions about what shapes evolutionary change that have yet to be resolved. According to Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, there is an inherent potential in evolution. The potential for change is inherent within the organism, and the shaping of its many parts occurs in a harmonic, coherent way. That is, change moves in a purposeful manner, not a random manner. The evolution of wings for flight, the eyes for sight, the nervous system for thought. Geoffroy was stating that these were not the results of countless minute mutations occurring and being selected upon separate from the other, but that the transformations were occurring with the very intention to create forms of flight, sight, and thought. By Darwin rejecting this thesis, he created a paradox within his own theory. Either the potential for change is inherent in the organism, in which many parts are able to change in a harmonic, coherent way, or it is not. However, if it is the latter, as Darwin claims it to be, random change of any part by itself without acknowledgement of the whole would more often than not lead to the death of the organism, as seen in the studies of embryo formation, or would create a Dr. Moreau's Island of Freaks, which, by the by, is another novel by our anti-hero H.G. Wells. The elegant creations we actually do see arise through evolutionary processes would be an extreme rarity in such a world of randomness. With everything we know today of the incredibly intricate details of biochemistry, the coordination of metabolic processes which occur in their thousands of parts would all need to evolve as randomly separate processes, and yet would also need to occur simultaneously and in conjunction with the other functioning parts. This would make Darwin's concept for the selection of random variants within a coordinated functioning whole fundamentally impossible. Not only is the evolution of the eye one of the miracles of evolution, it has countless variations upon itself, such that there is no one standard model for what is an eye. Are we thus to believe that this has randomly occurred not only once, but thousands of times in each species with its own distinct variation of what is an eye? At the time, there was strong opposition to Darwin and Huxley within Europe. Oops, forgot about that slide. Darwin and Huxley within Europe and the United States. James Dwight Dana, a contemporary of T.H. Huxley, was among the American leadership that opposed this view and argued that evolution did progress with a directionality, using examples such as the observation that biological organisms were proceeding towards greater cephalization. That is, complexity in their nervous systems. That is, that evolution was forming a general trend towards increasingly sophisticated nervous systems that could respond and interact with their environment. Thus, evolution was towards greater forms of complexity with more sophisticated forms of function. However, Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, was vehemently against this view of purposeful directionality in nature. It did not matter that Darwin's theory was just that, a theory, which still failed to explain much that was being observed in the evolutionary process. T.H. Huxley would be victorious in elevating Darwin's theory into accepted dogma and successfully circumventing the numerous holes in Darwin's theory in answering how life is formed and evolves. Despite these questions remaining unanswered to this day, Darwin's theory of evolution was celebrated as heralding a new age of science, a modern science. Out of this, two major changes occurred as a result of T.H. Huxley's avid promotion of Darwin's theory of evolution. One, nature, and thus one could say the universe, was not governed by purpose, but rather by randomness. And two, that humankind, was but a beast, no longer to be among the children of God, no longer regarded as partaking in anything that was divine or sacred. And if humankind is but a beast, What does he or she care for higher truths? What more does a beast need than the simple forms of comfort and happiness, the likes to which Mustafa Mond promoted in the Brave New World? I'd like to quickly add that the worshipping of DNA is a continuation and outcome of Darwin's theory of evolution, which is how we got to this whole transhumanist idea and how we went from being compared to apes to now being compared to computers. Apparently, we're allowed to think of ourselves as anything but human, it would appear. The discovery of the molecular structure of DNA was hailed as a holy grail when it was first discovered in 1953 by Watson and Crick. Everything that we are was apparently already contained within the supposed molecular instructions we had within us, that not only instructed how we were to be physically formed, but laid out the so-called blueprint for how our personalities, our temperaments, our desires, our addictions, our depravities were to be programmed within us. Those who upheld this view to its extreme began denying that there was such a thing as free will, that we had all been programmed from birth and thus predetermined in every action and outcome within our lives. As we see, Harari has continued this false belief in his thesis of humans being hackable algorithms, which I'll discuss further shortly. The Human Genome Project, which set out to map the entire human genome, thought it would be able to find the deterministic genes behind such unwanted traits as having a gambling addiction, debt, alcoholism, homelessness, etc. Applications toward sterilization and eugenics should not go unnoticed here under the guise of medicine. Suffice to say, to this day, there is no such proof that genes determine such things. The project had successfully collected a massive amount of data, but it is data largely without any meaning. They have relegated approximately 90% of our DNA into so-called junk DNA. The Human Genome Project failed in accomplishing its set out goals, though it is continued to be believed in academia that genes are what code all existence. Dawkins took it further and added the concept of a so-called selfish gene, that is a gene which contains a program for specific outcomes that we as individuals are unaware and thus unable to oppose. It was Watson and Crick who first championed the idea that DNA determines everything about the organism. They termed it the central dogma of biology. For the past 70 years, university textbooks and funding have unquestionably followed this dogma. Crick had stated that he, as a mere man, had eliminated the need for God or any other intelligence in the universe, since everything, everything about us flows from our DNA. He would write in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for a Soul, published in 1994, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. However, today, especially in the field of electromagnetism, this worshipping of DNA as the end-all be-all blueprint for all life has come under serious scrutiny. In a 15-minute presentation available on YouTube titled Electrical Shaping of Biology, Dr. Michael Claridge goes over some of the key problems with upholding DNA as the blueprint for all life. In one case study, he cites an experiment led by the Tufts University biologists. Flatworms have the ability to grow back their head or tail when they are cut off. However, in this experiment, the scientists had cut off the head of a species of flatworm, and subsequently, by changing the electromagnetic field surrounding the decapitated area, they were able to induce a new head to form that was from a different species of flatworm. The electromagnetic field needed to be specific in order to form one species of head versus another. The DNA did not change, only the electromagnetic field. Thus, the ability to adopt the form of another species is clearly not limited to the so-called deterministic structure of DNA.
Cynthia, is it possible to repeat the name of that? Oh, there is Dr. Michael Claridge. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. He actually gave a presentation earlier on for this Rising Tide Symposium. And you can find more of his work on Rising Tide as well. So Dr. Michael Claridgewood would say, why does any of this matter? It matters because the story of DNA that we grew up with and still teach to our children is not only wrong, it is actually harmful to our spirit because it gives us a false understanding of ourselves and of our relationship to the universe. We were told that a simple molecule with sequences of 4 molecular letters determines everything about us. We were assured that not only our shape, but our entire being is supposedly a simple unfolding of some molecular computer program into which we have no input. I find all aspects of this dogma incorrect and harmful. Maybe that was the intention all along. We have gone to comparing ourselves to apes to now comparing ourselves with computers. There is a clear avoidance in discussing what it is to be simply human. Oops. Alongside the biological studies in Darwinism of the 20th century were the mathematical studies which would uphold the same core Darwinistic principles of human nature and the universe, and that change was random, not purposeful. At least it was not a purpose we could ever understand as mere mortals. At the very start of the 20th century, the influential International Congress of Mathematicians organized a conference in Paris, France in 1900. It was at this conference that David Hilbert, a leading mathematician at Göttingen University, was invited to speak on the future of mathematics, where he stressed the need for the field of mathematics to, quote, prove that all axioms of arithmetic are consistent and to axiomatize those physical sciences in which mathematicians play an important role, end quote. What Hilbert was calling for in his challenge for the future of mathematics was that all scientific knowledge be reducible to the form of mathematical logic, that it be contained within a minimum of accepted truths and rules of derivation, which could be proven by consistent and complete formal mathematical proofs. Thus, all scientific knowledge would in the future be deduced from such mathematical models. There was nothing left to discover in the typical sense of what defined scientific investigation during the 19th century and earlier. Scientists only needed to refer to the appropriate mathematical model for their answers. In 1900, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead set out to meet Hilbert's challenge, which resulted in the Principia Mathematica published 13 years later. Although Kurt Gödel would disprove the entire premise for the Principia Mathematica with his incompleteness theorems, the Principia Mathematica remains as one of the most influential works of the 20th century and into the 21st century, and not only shaping modern logic, but also formed the basis for the latter development of cybernetics and systems analysis by Russell's student Norbert Wiener during World War II, which was used as the operating system upon which transhumanism was based. In other words, Principia Mathematica put forward the argument that all knowledge is reducible to mathematical logic. Despite having been disproven, it is irregardlessly viewed as a mainstay in philosophy and mathematics to this day, and is what has led to the development of cybernetics. Before you conclude that Russell himself didn't personally believe that irrationality was a fundamental force in the universe simply because he tried to formalize said universe, it is worth reading a section of his bitterly misanthropic view of humanity presented in his 1903 A Free Man's Worship, which, Peter, if you want to read it, you can
Hi, coming up. That man is the product of causes that had no prevision of the end they were achieving, and his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built.
At least Russell does not deny that the result of a so-called free man's worship, which is, according to Russell, the denial of the existence of a loving creator, and thus the belief ultimately that man must replace God. As we have recently discovered, this idea of the vast death of the universe, something so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand, has also become an assumption that is now on very shaky ground. Russell was so certain of this Big Bang theory as yet another triumph over those arguing for a universe with direction and purpose, with a loving creator, that he was actually proud of his apparent free man's worship that was built on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. However, it turns out the Big Bang Theory is also wrong, and now we can prove it. This is just a picture of an article that is going over the James Webb findings and showing that these findings are now seriously contradicting the theory of Big Bang. If you want the link, you can go to my Substack version of this class, and it will have the link within it, or just search the title and you'll be able to find it. Thus, Russell looks rather ridiculous in his version of a free man's worship. It rather looks like Russell has been eating out of a trash bin this whole time when there was an abundant feast laid beside him. Whether deterministic or random in
May I ask you a
view...
question, Cynthia?
Sure, yeah.
What is that, James, the telescope that was mentioned, in what way is it contradicting Big Bang? Just in one or two lines, if you...
I'm not an expert in talking about that, but if you read the article, it goes through some of the findings that they're saying that are contradicting. Because Matt, are you able to say a few words on like how it's saying that there's more galaxies that are being formed or something like that, right?
Yeah, and we could take this back up in the Q&A section, not to derail it, but essentially the empirical data coming in from the new telescope is demonstrating that all the calculations that have concluded that the universe, according to the standard model Big Bang, is 13.72 billion years. It's impossible. It would have to be something more like 18 or 19 billion years, but then there's other contradictions as well that emerge. It's messy. The article is pretty thorough.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think it's also showing that there are new galaxies that are forming, which is in contradiction to the entropic view of the universe, as well as just winding down and things are dying but not being created again in the universe. So yes, whether deterministic or random in view, the goal was the same: to dishonestly promote a concept of the universe that had no governing purpose, no directionality, and no morality, that it was essentially a mechanism discoverable by a few simple mathematical laws. With such a view, our connection to the universe becomes inconsequential, with the universe seen as something cold, unknowable, and ultimately dead or dying. Such a concept only further enforces that there is no real meaning to anything. There is no purpose, at least it is not a purpose that we have any place in. However, as we have seen thus far, none of these dogmatic beliefs in the modern sciences, in other words, the sole focus on the materialistic reductionist sciences, has been demonstrated through the rigors of actual scientific investigation, though it has been assumed that this is the case. In fact, these dogmas have been seen on rather shaky ground when put under an honest scientific scrutiny, or have been outright disproven. Yet the belief continues under the guise of modern science. It turns out Harari is not the only one that relies more on prophecy than on scientific or philosophical rigor. Rather, after closer inspection, it would appear Harari is a descendant of a school of thought that seems to be made up of primarily false prophets and wannabe demigods, rather than what would even remotely qualify as a scientist. Lastly, before discussing the algorithms of Harari, let us review a mathematical model that has come to govern all levels of how society functions. Game theory is considered by many to be an essential tool when modeling economic, political, sociological, and military behaviors and outcomes, and is taught as such in many prestigious universities as something pretty much set in stone. Game theory, the mathematical theory of games of strategy, was developed by John von Neumann in his book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which he co-authored with Oscar Morgenstern. The crux of the theory is that an individual's behavior will always be motivated towards achieving an optimal outcome, which is determined by selfish self-interest. It is acknowledged by John von Neumann in his own book that the entire functioning of their model relies upon the assumption that we are governed by rational selfish behavior, and that they feel confident about this assumption since reality has apparently confirmed this fact to them. The reason why mathematicians feel safe in making such assumptions, like the assumptions Harari's algorithms are laden with, is due to the continued dogmatic belief in Darwinism, and thus such an assumption that is put into an influential mathematical model no longer needs to be questioned. It is regarded as a fact in the world of mathematics. However, it is not a fact, and thus the entire model is rendered as a useless tool of prediction. It is, however, a very useful tool in conditioning, in programming the desired behavior a controller like a Brave New World Mustafa Mond would like to see in the people. In the case of game theory, they do not even attempt to prove that we are ultimately these predictable computer programs that will operate based on the most optimal outcome motivated by selfish self-interest. The entire hypothesis is based off of an assumption, and this is what we are calling modern science, which is apparently free from dogmatic belief systems. Such an oversimplification of human nature shows the audacity behind the assumptions that make up such formulations like game theory. You are nothing more than a virtual avatar in their synthetic world, with programmed limits to what you can and cannot do in the game they have created for you. Game theory doesn't represent the motivations behind human nature, but rather imposes such limitations, since, as they acknowledge themselves, it is easier to predict and control your chosen selfish behaviors, which are encouraged and rewarded with incentives within these games. It is a system of enslavement that encourages its slaves to fight each other for table scraps and never question the hand that withholds, the system that creates false scarcity and promotes antagonism over artificial stressors. We are taught never to question the rules given to us in these game theory scenarios, but to react accordingly to what has been defined to us as a limited set of options in an artificial scenario. The entertainment industry has pushed this idea that the best we can do as we are told we are headed towards an apocalyptic future is to merely adapt and survive, a survival at all costs. We've been conditioned to this idea of a survival at all costs, that is, a survival of the fittest within a post-apocalyptic world. We have learned to view this as our liberation, this false and delusional idea that as long as one can survive, such a life is worth living. We have been conditioned to not question our circumstances or how we got here. We've been conditioned to think that there is no solution and that the only thing we can do is just accept the increasingly bleak future we are told is necessary and inevitable. Our life becomes similar to that of a lab rat who has no choice but to abide by the parameters of the game they were put in and figure out any means for survival. And in such a life, we have been conditioned to view that freedom and liberation can be attained if we earn the gold medal in such apocalyptic Olympic games. Freedom is no longer about questioning, resisting, and challenging the oppression and enslavement of a society, but rather it focuses on its best subjects, so to speak, its best survivors, who can best wield the sort of behavior its controllers want to see. It is Darwin's survival of the fittest in its final conclusion. Let us all be honest with ourselves. Is there any dystopic vision we have for the future that is not imagery we have collected from some Hollywood sci-fi movie or novel? The very pictures in our head about major issues and subjects, including about what determines the future, are increasingly being placed in our mind from the entertainment industry. Can you really say you are in charge of your thoughts if you allow yourself to be governed by such dystopic imagery? Thus, it should not surprise us that Harari has stated that the best use for the so-called useless people is to put them on drugs and play video games. That it is essential that we are already living in, that is essentially what we are already living in if you are an adherent to game theory, cybernetics, and transhumanism. I guess, Peter, if you want to read Harari's quote, go ahead.
Here we are. I think the biggest question maybe in economics and politics of the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. I don't think we have an economic model for that. My best guess, which is just a guess, is that food will not be a problem. With that kind of technology, you will be able to produce food to feed everybody. The problem is more boredom and what to do with them, and how they will find some sense of meaning in life when they are basically meaningless, worthless. My best guess at present is a combination of drugs and computer games. Now, Cynthia, I know he used the term useless, and Henry Kissinger used that in Useless Eaters and a lot of writings that came out in the early 70s.
Yeah, it's probably not coincidental. I mean, Harari was clearly being groomed as well for when they, like gave him his introduction to the world with the World Economic Forum presentation. There was a clear grooming of how he was to speak, because he spoke differently than he was in his interviews before that, and in terms of what he was stressing. So it's not just, Harari that's deciding how he's speaking or the solutions that he's coming up with. He has a group of people around him. So, right, this idea of putting people on drugs and on video games, you don't have to literally be on drugs and video games to be still a construct within a game. If you, again, abide by the game theory ideology, the cybernetics ideology, you are still functioning within a computer game, even if you are not literally on video games and on drugs. However, this promotion is not a superior human or a humanoid computer. This is a human bounding themselves to the rules of a game that have been artificially created to enslave them, rather than to the laws of the universe, and abiding by the artificial parameters created for them within such a game, believing this to be more real than reality itself. Let us look at some of the formulations Harari has made in order to promulgate his theory that humans are hackable. So again, just to remind people, an algorithm in mathematics and computer science, it's a finite sequence of rigorous instructions typically used to solve a class of specific problems or to perform a computation. So these are main points that were taken from Harari's first presentation to the World Economic Forum, and they're pretty much quotes from him. So he makes the point that the masters of society will be decided by who will own the data. Now data is replacing machinery as the most important asset, and if too much of the data becomes concentrated into too few hands, humanity will be split, not into classes this time, but into species. Those who will form the superior species will be able to hack not only computers, but human beings and all other life forms. All you need to hack life is enough biometric data, which will tell you, in the case of humans, what they are thinking, what they are motivated by, and what they desire, what is going on inside the brain. Organisms are biochemical algorithms, and we are learning how to decipher these algorithms. When the infotech merges with the biotech revolution, what you get is the ability to hack human beings. One of the most important tools in collecting the necessary data to understand biological algorithms is the biometric sensor. If something is hackable, it means it will be able to also be engineered. Evolution by natural selection is now being replaced by evolution by intelligent design, not by some guy above the clouds, but our intelligent design. And the intelligent design of our clouds, the IBM cloud, the Microsoft cloud, these are the new driving forces of evolution. So Harari tends to use sexual orientation and generalized political leaning reduced to cheerleading for a team as his examples of the controllers knowing what we think. It is possible that Harari thinks humans are this simple since he himself may be this simple. However, this is a lower order of existence. It is a beast-like existence where Harari claims the controllers of all data will know what excites you, causes you fear, makes you desirous, and so forth based off of biometric data. But can it know your deeper, more profound thoughts? If you think of yourself as a mere beast governed by your senses, then such a system, simply based off of biometric data, may be able to predict your future behavior and incentivize or deter certain behaviors. But you would have to voluntarily reduce yourself to the existence of a beast that lives from moment to moment, day by day, in order for this to work. Just like the false prophets of game theory, Harari's so-called hackable human is in reality someone who has on some level voluntarily reduced themselves to fit into the parameters of such a reality. In other words, if you see yourself as a slave or just a pawn to the game masters, you will act like a slave or a pawn, but this fate is not inescapable. This is the centuries-old game. Those who control the economics governing a people are able to create the illusion of false scarcity and thus a lack of opportunity and choice in what happens to us in life. The concept of Harari's biological algorithms, like game theory, are meant as justifications for our self-imposed enslavement. What is being claimed as the omnipotence of biological algorithm is essentially the same thing that was being said about DNA and the selfish gene, that you can't change your destiny. It is predetermined. You have no free will. This is why they want you to be as simple-minded as possible, and why they want you to believe that you are just a blob of flesh programmed to desire pleasure and avoid pain. If you agree to lower yourself to this simple existence, you will be the most easy to predict and control. Lie detectors use a great deal of the same measurements that biometric sensors measure, such as blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rhythm, etc. However, polygraph test results are inadmissible in court as they are not scientifically reliable enough for use when the stakes are so high as in a court of law. This is because it is well documented that certain people can pass the test while lying, and others who are telling the truth can fail the test. Yet Harari is claiming that biometric sensors, which are pretty much just measuring the same things as a polygraph, except for also eye movement, are somehow going to tell us what is going on in our brain, which he equates to the mind. If a polygraph isn't even admissible in a court of law, why are we going to believe Harari's stark predictions for the future as something even possible? They want you to think that they have maximum control over you so that you are defeated in your own imagined parameters that don't even exist in reality. In a mental prison, there's no need for 4 actual walls to confine you. If we believe in our mental prison, there is no need to have an actual prison. If we believe that they are capable of all of these incredible capabilities, we are accepting that we have essentially lost. You have been defeated within a mental construct that is but an illusion. It is the ultimate tool for absolute control, to defeat someone in their own mind before they can even fully contemplate the thought of rebellion. Such a technique was already outlined in Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. I misspelled it in the in the slide. It should be an N at Panopticon. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon scenario. The concept is to allow all prisoners of an institution to be observed by a single security guard without the inmates knowing whether they are being watched. Although it is physically impossible for the single guard to observe all the inmates' cells at once, the fact that the inmates cannot know when they are being watched motivates them to act as though they are all being watched at all times. They are effectively compelled to self-regulation. Jeremy Bentham was another mathematician, ethical hedonist, who believed moral rightness or wrongness of action to be a function of the amount of pleasure or pain that it produced, again, reducing us to just desiring pleasure, avoiding pain. He formulated the algorithm called hedonistic calculus or philosophic calculus. And in the picture, you are seeing a mummified head, his mummified head between his legs, which is apparently what he had requested, that it be put there. But I think, I forgot exactly where this was like being showcased, but I think a few years ago they put the mummified head just in a case and not between his legs anymore because too many people were disturbed by it. Based off of this doom and gloom prophecy of Harari's, what does he finally offer up as a solution to the inevitability 2 years after his first presentation to the World Economic Forum? Where he is claiming, right, that we have no choice but to live in this world where you will have two different species now, one that controls all the data and one that doesn't. At the time when he was bringing this up, people were asking him, how can we avoid this? Like, what can we do? And he really didn't have any answers. But when he came back 2 years later to the World Economic Forum, his answer was world regulation. And who will be the world regulators of this technology? Well, the World Economic Forum attempts to be coy in this, but obviously it's themselves. And Singapore, unfortunately, has been the first to voluntarily subject themselves to this, where the World Economic Forum has been directly brought in to oversee Singapore's new AI initiatives. So apparently, our future is only doomed if we fail to elect the World Economic Forum as the overseers of the world. So this kind of explains why such a promotion of Harari's doomsday prophecy to get people really worked up and worried, and then, you know, World Economic Forum comes in to save everybody. Let's return to a question I had asked at the beginning of this lecture about a modern science begetting a modern religion, begetting a modern utopia. Harari, again, would say at, I forgot where he said this actually, but he would say, we have no answer in the Bible of what to do when humans are no longer useful to the economy. You need completely new ideologies, completely new religions. And they are likely to emerge from Silicon Valley and not from the Middle East. And they are likely going to give people visions based on technology. Everything that the old religions promised, happiness and justice and even eternal life, but here on earth with the help of technology and not after death with the help of some supernatural being. This line of speaking is very much along the lines of H.G. Wells, who was among the first, if not the first, to really discuss this concept of a modern religion, the need for a modern religion. and that science would play a large role in bringing this about, modern science. Religion was considered still a useful tool, but now its focus would not be on a creator of the heavens, but rather on the worshiping of man as creator, who would take on the task of creating future man and all living life for all of futurity. In H.G. Wells's Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, he makes no qualms in declaring his trilogy, The Outlines of History, The Science of Life, which he co-wrote with Julian Huxley, who coined the term transhumanism, and the work Wealth and Happiness of Mankind as the New Bible. He wrote in Open Conspiracy, I have told already how I have schemed out a group of writings to embody the necessary ideas of the new time in a form adopted to the current reading public. I've made a sort of provisional Bible, so to speak, for some factors, at least in the Open Conspiracy. Fundamentally, the Open Conspiracy must be an intellectual rebirth. And it was T.H. Huxley who was H.G. Wells's mentor. Thus, Wells was also heavily influenced by the work of Malthus and Darwin. Wells would also write in his Open Conspiracy. Peter, if you can go ahead.
To avoid the positive evils of war and to attain the new levels of prosperity and power that now come into view, an effective world control, not merely of armed force, but of the production and main movements of staple commodities and the drift and expansion of population is required. It is absurd to dream of peace and worldwide progress without that much control. The Open Conspiracy is not necessarily antagonistic to any existing government. The Open Conspiracy is a creative, organizing movement and not an anarchistic one. It does not want to destroy existing controls and forms of human association, but either to supersede or amalgamate them into a common world directorate. The League of Nations, the birth control movement, and most radical and socialist societies are fields into which Open Conspiracy is a fuller and ampler movement into which these incomplete activities must necessarily merge as its idea takes possession of men's imaginations.
So this very much, explains the World Economic Forum type of vision. And the World Economic Forum is a big deal, but it really is a branch from these ideas that have been around for a very long time and that they've been tried to be executed in many different under many different names, like the League of Nations. He even brings up the birth control movement as well. And it's important that we understand that it's the philosophy, this ideology that is attached to all of the components that I've been speaking about in this lecture, and thus you can appreciate how embedded it is within our system of thought and how we already organize our society around bad ideas, wrong ideas of what defines humanity and what defines the world we live in, that it's not just like a World Economic Forum product. This is much bigger than the World Economic Forum, but the World Economic Forum is one instrument right now to encourage this line of thinking. This is the last slide for the Open Conspiracy.
The Open Conspiracy will build up an encyclopedic conception of the modern economic complex as a labyrinthine pseudo-system, progressively eliminating waste and working its way along multitudinous channels toward unity, toward clarity of a utilitarian purpose and method, toward abundant productivity and efficient social service. The character of the Open Conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as widespread and evident as socialism and communism. It will have taken the place of these movements very largely. It will be more than they were. It will be, frankly, a world religion. This large, loose, assimilatory mass of movements, groups, and societies will be definitely and obviously attempting to swallow up the entire population of the world and become the new human community.
So again, this is not to scare people, because the whole point of this lecture is to try to empower people and realize that these are ultimately absurdities and they have no place in reality. But the open conspiracy is something that has already occurred, right, in our Western society. That they clearly wanted it to be a world open conspiracy, but I think that clearly is having more of an opposition than they were expecting. But what has happened within our educational institutions, within our political institutions, again, like Darwinism and game theory being very prevalent, ways of thinking that have affected all fields of thought. This has been something that has infiltrated our culture and how our society is organized. So it's not just to be worried about like one institution like the World Economic Forum, but to realize that our entire apparatus, including the universities themselves, have been largely hijacked by this ideology that H.G. Wells is putting forward. And so it has been largely successful in derailing where we were naturally headed in as a direction. This was derailed, especially after World War II. And for those who want to know more on this, well, before I even say that, the reference to communism and socialism should also be very interesting, because there's a lot of blame, right, on Russia and China being the ones that are causing all of the havoc that we are clearly seeing occurring within the Western world. And it should become clear when you look at how old these ideas are and what are the roots of these ideas, that it was never a foreign infiltration that occurred, but it was something that happened within our own side of the world that created this kind of ideology. And it's interesting, that Wells brings up communism and socialism. It's going to be too big of a topic for this lecture, but you should keep in mind that the Fabian Society was also very much interested in utilizing communism and socialism ultimately for fascist endeavors. And I would say, as just a quick explanation for people, the reference to communism and socialism that Wells is referring to here is best understood through the work of Georges Sorel, who is investigating how socialism and communism could be warped in order to support a fascist outlook. The Italian fascists largely took up Georges Sorel's work, and is why they called themselves the National Socialists before the world came to know them as Italian fascists. H.G. Wells was also involved with the socialist and communist circles surrounding the Fabian Society, as well as the pro-fascist circles in Britain. Oswald Mosley publicly supported Wells's vision for a scientific dictatorship. For those who don't know, Oswald Mosley was basically the leader of the Nazi grouping in Britain, or fascist grouping in Britain. And for people who want to know more about this, they can refer to my book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set, where I go into this discussion in a lot more detail. So Wells would conclude in his open conspiracy, very much along the lines of how Oswald Mosley would also write about this need for basically a pan-Europe concept as well, which was they never succeeded in the League of Nations concept, but they did succeed in forming the European Union, which was modeled off of this old idea. Wells writes, the establishment of the world community will surely exact a price, and who can tell what that price may be in toil, suffering, and blood. And, the World War II would happen. Well, I forgot exactly what year the open conspiracy was, but over a decade before World War II. H.G. Wells also did a lot of sci-fi novels. This is what he's most popular for. He wrote The First Men in the Moon, where he put forward what he had concluded as the most superior form of community organization, modeled off of the ant colony. No joke. Each subspecies type would have the physical and mental attributes best suitable to their specialized narrow tasks in serving the ant community. H.G. Wells was also obsessed with equating head size with intelligence, and thus we see the most intelligent members of the ant colony with bulbous heads. The smarter the ant, the larger the head. There's a quote in the picture to the right, wobbling jellies of knowledge. Yes, they had a special thing where their cranium, they didn't really have like a fully formed bone structure, so that their heads could there was no limit to how large their heads could grow. This was Wells's dream for what could form a stable, peaceful organizational system for humans. It was what inspired the work of Aldous Huxley in his Brave New World and his biological hierarchy, or biological caste system, created in a lab to produce epsilons, deltas, betas, alphas, alpha pluses, and the about 13 or so world controllers, likely imagined with bulbous heads. And in order to now discuss this idea of transhumanism, I'm going to bring up C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, which is really well done essay lecture he did. I would suggest that everyone actually read it. It's available on the internet. It's not a very long read, and it's quite impressive how Lewis, I believe, did this lecture in the 30s or the 40s, and he's has so much insight into where the world was headed, in just based off of philosophically looking at what would be the logical consequences of these actions if you were to believe in this kind of Darwinistic extreme Darwinistic viewpoint, which H.G. Wells was heavily promoting in his sci-fi novels. So C.S. Lewis wrote a response to this, largely to directly what H.G. Wells was doing, but also it was becoming very popular, this kind of transhumanist idea. And so he wrote a sci-fi series in response to this, which I've done a lecture series on. He writes in The Abolition of Man, which is also, so the sci-fi trilogy is the fictional answer to it. That Hideous Strength is a really, again, really well done response to and mockery of what would be the logical consequence of if you had people trying to create a transhumanist superior, human. But he also did a lecture series, and The Abolition of Man is his response to the transhumanist movement, which Peter, you can go ahead and read.
The Abolition of Man. In what sense is man the possessor of increasing power over nature? The final stages come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. The battle will indeed be won. But who, precisely, will have won it? They, these conditioners, are rather not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Good and bad are words without content, for it is from them that the ground to stand on outside of the, for it is from them that the content of these words is henceforward to be derived. However far back they go, or down, they can find no ground to stand on outside of the Tao. Every motive they try to act on becomes at once petitio, Latin, begging the question, informal fallacy. It is not that they are bad men. They are not men at all. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men. They are not men at all. They are artifacts. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man.
We're going to read a few more excerpts from The Abolition of Man, but I wanted to also just clarify. So The Abolition of Man is part of a 3-part essay series. Men Without Chests is the first part, The Way, or the Tao, is the second part, and then Abolition of Men is the third part. And so he's referring to the Tao because he has a whole second part section of it, which we will read out of order. We're going to read the third excerpts of the third part first, and then we'll read excerpts of the Tao, because the Tao is really the answer to these things. So what he's saying here, for people, if they had a hard time understanding, is he's hypothesizing, right? What is the final stage of this eugenics, transhumanist, prenatal conditioning? What will be the ultimate results? And he's saying that the battle will be won, this battle between nature and men, but who exactly will have won it? He's making the point that, and he's going to expand upon this, that these people, by forsaking the Tao, which is basically the traditional value system, or what you could call natural law, by forsaking this, they have stepped into the void, and they are no longer men. So this has been the abolition of man from this standpoint. But again, what is going to be the ultimate conclusion? We're going to read on and see where C.S. Lewis is going with this.
When all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. The conditioners, therefore, must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure. Those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another, except the emotional strength of that impulse. By the logic of their position, they must take their impulses as they come, from chance. And chance here means nature. Their extreme rationalism, by seeing through all rational motives, leaves them creatures of wholly irrational behavior. If you will not obey the Tao, or else commit suicide, obedience to impulse, and therefore, in the long run, to mere nature, is the only course left open.
So you see that turnaround that he made, that this conquest of, as Harari is saying, like, we will be the gods. It won't be some guy in the sky or even, nature, right? We will become the intelligent designers, which is a view that all of the people being mentioned, in this lecture, that this is what they're promoting as the ultimate goal. And what C.S. Lewis is making the point is that if you are no longer governed by what is the good, that is, you reject natural law, then you only have I want remaining. You only have your desires, but these desires that are not grounded in any way of judging value, and thus there isn't a hierarchy in how you're choosing your desires or your pleasures. So you become entirely governed by impulse, and it's only possibly the difference of like how much you desire something over another thing. Ultimately, by rejecting the value system, you become obedient to your most base, functioning level, which is to basically again become a slave of nature. So it's like the very opposite. You thought that you were conquering nature, but the ultimate consequence of choosing such extreme ways of governing yourself or following things has made you actually a slave, a biggest slave. And Plato gets at this in the Gorgias dialogue, which is also again, I highly recommend people read this, because this question of like, is it really the best thing to seek pleasure and avoid pain? Is that what everyone's goal should be? And Plato's bringing up that if you have nothing to be able to judge a higher pleasure, more qualitative pleasure, right? Because doing good can also be a form of pleasure. He likens it to someone who is obsessed with just obtaining pleasure, that it's like a vase with like a bunch of holes in it that you're constantly obsessed with filling as all of the contents are coming out of the holes. When you think of it from that standpoint, it is a very slavish, very unhappy existence, where you will never feel satiated. You will never feel complete in that. Whereas you can feel complete if you have a more qualitative way of judging value.
At the moment, then, of man's victory over nature, we find the whole human race subjected to some individual men, and those individuals subjected to that in themselves which is purely natural, to their irrational impulses. Nature, untrammeled by values, rules the conditioners, and through them, all humanity. Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. Every victory we seem to win has led us, step by step, to this conclusion. All nature's apparent reverses have been but tactical withdrawals. We thought we were beating her back when she was luring us on. What looked to us like hands held up in surrender was really the opening of arms to enfold us forever. If the fully planned and conditioned world, with its Tao a mere product of the planning, comes into existence, nature will be troubled no more by the restive species that rose in revolt against her so many millions of years ago, will be vexed no longer by its chatter of truth and mercy and beauty and happiness. And if the eugenics are efficient enough, there will be no second revolt, but all snug beneath the conditioners, and the conditioners beneath her, till the moon falls or the sun grows cold.
So yes, this emphasis on man's conquest of nature turns out in the moment of its consummation to be nature's conquest of man, the abolition of man. Stepping outside the Tao, they have stepped into the void. Now, this last part is hypothetical, right? So C.S. Lewis is just saying, hypothetically, if we were to logically proceed with what would be the consequences of such an extreme way of governing ourselves through this like transhumanist ideology, this would be the result. And so the entire thing is a complete absurdity on itself. It's not something that can achieve the power that it thinks it can achieve. However, the good news is that they would not even be successful in reaching that point where, we would all be just the subjects of these crazy wannabe gods, that in the end we would all be enfolded into nature in like a dark slumber forever. That's not how it's going to play out. And he explains why this is the case in the second part, actually, which is the way, the Tao, that this hypothetical scenario can't even happen because it's on such an absurdity. Nobody can really operate for too long on that kind of a construct. So the point here being that you cannot create the laws of the universe anew. Thus, far from achieving the status of a god like Icarus and his wax wings, they have only caused their own self-destruction, these wannabe new gods. So C.S. Lewis now is giving us what is the real situation, because we live in a universe that already has laws, and this is how we're going to be operating in such a system.
The way, the Tao. It looks, in fact, as if an ethics based on instinct will give the innovator all he wants and nothing that he does not want. In reality, we have not advanced one step, for I think it is here being used in a fairly definite sense to mean an unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given species. In what way does instinct, thus conceived, help us define real values? Telling us to obey instinct is like telling us to obey people. People say different things. So do instincts. Our instincts are at war. Each instinct, if you listen to it, will claim to be gratified at the expense of all the rest. And the idea that, without appealing to any court higher than the instincts themselves, we can yet find grounds for preferring one instinct above its fellows dies very hard.
So this idea of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, he's saying that right there, you can't just operate off of that kind of modus operandi, because you have to have a value system. You have to have a way of judging everything that we do, and how we think and frame things, and our relationship to things is all based on value judgments. So the question is, you can't do that without any value judgment. The question now is, can you do it with a different value judgment than what we've been traditionally operating off of, which he also gets into.
The truth finally becomes apparent that neither in any operation with factual propositions, nor in any appeal to instinct can the innovator find the basis for a system of values. None of the principles he requires are to be found there, but they are all to be found somewhere else. All within the four C's are his brothers, says Confucius. Do as you would be done by, says Jesus. All the practical principles behind the innovator's case for posterity, or society, or the species are there from time immemorial in the Tao, but they are nowhere else. The innovator attacks traditional values, the Tao, in defense of what he at first supposes to be, in some special sense, rational or biological values. But as we have seen, all the values which he uses in attacking the Tao, and even claims to be substituting for it, are themselves derived from the Tao. If the Tao fails, all his own conceptions of value fall with it. Not one of them can claim any authority other than that of the Tao. Only by such shreds of the Tao as he has inherited is he enabled even to attack it.
So that's what he's bringing up, is that there is not one word for the Tao. We've had a discovery of a traditional value system in many different parts of the world and many different cultures, and this is why he brings up that both Confucius and Jesus have both understood these principles of the Tao in its teachings. It's not contained in one book, in one doctrine form, but it is what we have seen as a universal recognition to what he will later also say. You can call it natural law, traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, the first platitudes. He chooses to call it the Tao, which is, in reference to the Chinese philosophy. But we have all come to the same discovery of these basic value systems and principles. And it is not just like something that we have made up and we've made into a school of thought. It is how everything is created and how it interacts. And so we cannot, you'd have to really turn yourself inside out, almost make yourself like schizophrenic or something, to try to think of the world in such an opposite way to what are the basic, value systems. And Lewis also gets to the point of that just because it's a traditional value system doesn't mean that it's something rigid that will never change, or that there aren't problems with like how it's been expressed in the past, that there's been, imperfect understanding of it, imperfect execution of it, imperfect writing of it. And so it can become further perfected, this understanding of what is this universal value system, this system that's based in the laws of the universe and how it functions. We can make this better, but it's not from a standpoint of trying to tear it all down. We have to recognize that there are core truths within it, and only by recognizing those core truths can you then be in a place where you can further perfect it. It's not something that we can just replace with another value system, as we see very clearly they're attempting to do today. This is the last slide.
Since I can see no answer to these questions, I draw the following conclusions. This thing which I have called for convenience the Tao, and which others may call natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of values. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There has never been, and never will be, a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. The rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. The human mind has no more power of inventing a new value than of imagining a new primary color, or indeed of creating a new sun and a new sky for it to move in. There is a difference between a real moral advance and a mere innovation. From the Confucian, do not do to others what you would not like them to do to you, to the Christian, do as you would be done by, is a real advance. The morality of Nietzsche is a mere innovation. The first is an advance because no one who did not admit the validity of the old maxim could see reason for accepting the new one. And anyone who accepted the old would at once recognize the new as an extension of the same principle. If he rejected it, he would have to reject it as a superfluity, something that went too far, not as something simply heterogeneous from his own ideas of value. But the Nietzschean ethic can be accepted only if we are ready to scrap traditional morals as a mere error, and then to put ourselves in a position where we can find no ground for any value judgments at all. It is the difference between a man who says to us, "You like your vegetables moderately fresh. Why not grow your own and have them perfectly fresh?" And a man who says, "Throw away that loaf and try eating bricks and centipedes instead." Those who understand the spirit of the Tao and who have been led by that spirit can modify it in directions which that spirit itself demands. Only they can know what those directions are.
Thus, don't be fooled by today's self-professed magicians, the Wizards of Oz, who claim such lofty powers. It is all sitting on a hill of sand and is only a mere illusion of what it is to be all-powerful. To deny that anything noble came out of our civilization, such as the wonderful discoveries that have been made in various fields, which have not only uplifted our life, but offered us such wonders as being able to ascertain a beauty that can only come through higher learning. If we deny this, we are denying that civilized part within ourselves. We are cutting out our better nature. Schiller talked about the savage and the barbarian in his aesthetical letters. He wrote, "Man can be self-opposed in twofold manner, either as savage, if his feelings rule his principles, or as a barbarian, if his principles destroy his feelings." If we convince ourselves that we are most noble as a savage or barbarian, then we will be most easily controlled through our base desires and enslaved. The more noble our nature, the more free we are. Thus, it is no coincidence that a system of empire would not want us to identify with a just and beautiful concept of our civilization. It is the most prevalent and effective censorship one could have. There is no need to censure books and free speech when people have no desire to read or speak them in the first place. The problem with the misuse of technology is thus, what is the governing structure's intention for such a society? Today, our world primarily lives to benefit tyranny. Our financial system, our education system, our culture, our rewriting of history, our outright censorship of history, our sciences have all been taken over. Thus, it is not just a technological crisis we are living in, it is foremost an existential crisis. We will not solve an existential crisis by simply taking certain materials out of our lives. We have to become reconnected to our better selves and no longer abide to serve a system that upholds tyranny. Tyranny does not require advanced technology to exist. Tyranny reigns supreme wherever we find a people who do not view themselves as free, strong, and dignified. That is our crisis today. It is in the wannabe controller's best interest that we view the situation as hopeless, that we view it as inevitable, since we will not oppose such a future if we have already been mentally defeated. We will not risk anything to fight for a better future if we think a better future is not possible. We will simply be content to live moment to moment, hoping we can delay as much as possible the dark clouds looming ahead. Our nature is not what we've been told by the likes who have promoted the doctrine of modern science and modern religion. We are, in fact, beings that are sacred and partake in the good, the true, and the beautiful. We have been lied to and debased in order that we be more easily controlled. It is up to every individual whether they choose to exit this artificial reality that has been created to enslave their mind within a mental construct and participate instead in what it is to be truly human. Our freedom, our salvation from the spiritual torment of our existential crisis can rather simply be accessed if we recognize our true nature, not as a savage or barbarian, but our best nature, our most noble nature. As Schiller would write in his aesthetical letters, it is through beauty, that is, a noble soul, that we arrive at freedom. And that is the end.